And yet Hayden White was called on the carpet because of the Holocaust, because he was saying that, the skeptical idea. So some people were saying, well, if you're going to talk about historical relativism in that way, you're giving aid and comfort to Holocaust deniers. So what do you say to that, Hayden White? And so what his response was to say, well, originally there was not objective history, but now we have found the middle voice. So since the Holocaust, history has been objective, which was the weakest, poorest cop-out I ever heard anyone say anything. And so Hayden White's whole project, in my view, just crumbled because of that. Although the criticism that in the past people have leaned to too much definiteness about the past certainly is valid. And now people are, as compensation for that, leaning too much the other way. Currently, in ancient and medieval history, the watchword is quite ultra-skepticism, although really ancient history went through its ultra-skeptical phase a few generations ago under the German critics, and Middle Eastern history now is split where you have a very polemical school of Western historians essentially attacking the roots of Islam, and the Muslims naturally don't accept that, and then some other historians are not so ultra-critical. And in these arguments, Western historians will say, well, if there is no material proof, it didn't happen, which is kind of a dangerous, slippery slope to get on, because that would undermine the possibility of saying much that is probable about the past. And so they want something like the papyrus document dated to the year 22 of the Hijra, which shows that in the year 22, the new Islamic calendrical system was in use with a new counting of the years, and that was said to have been introduced in the year 18, so that's a very early, satisfactory material proof. Now, what's the state of material proof as regards the Quran? And since this has even been in the press somewhat with that rather ridiculous article in the Atlantic Monthly on this subject that a while ago, did any of you read that or see it? None of you took notice of that? Oh, well. See, with the Bible, all of the manuscripts that exist under the sun have been collated, and every single sentence and every single word has been investigated by a microscope, and little pieces of the margins have been cut off to make radiocarbon dating, and nothing has been left unturned to establish what is the limits of the historicity of that. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, you saw all the big hullabaloo about that because of the slowness of the scholars who had been charged with working on that and how it was broken open and so forth. So you'd think, well, what about the Quran? Well, that work has hardly begun to be done with regard to the Quran, of collating all the manuscripts, figuring out which ones are the most ancient ones, and all of that. And naturally, these manuscripts, like biblical manuscripts, aren't dated, because in the early times of scribal traditions in a place, they would not go around putting the dates on things. Later, they got in the habit of doing that, and when they copied a manuscript, they'd put the date, but maybe the holy books too, because they shouldn't have extra words in them, they tended not to have that. So, although I think very much later Quranic manuscripts become dated, but the oldest ones aren't. So you don't have any dates on those. And also, you don't have the epigraphy, meaning the styles of writing figured out with a great deal of accuracy. So you have some people saying, yes, pardon?
I was wondering if they were copied out by professional scribes and very rituals, like the Torah. The Torah can only be written copied out by a scribe who's very specially trained, who goes through very specific rituals and rites before doing it. Is it the same hold true for the Quran?
Not so much. It's not to that extent. But the person has to have washed up and be in a state of purity, of course, to be writing it. But it's not as complicated. And yet, there is some of the same of that. In the case of a Torah scroll, if one letter is erased and can't be repaired also by a ritualistic manner, the whole thing has to be thrown away. And to some extent, you might find that would be true of the Quran too. That is, the Quran shouldn't contain any mistake in the writing, and the writing of it follows a quite specific, particular pattern, and so a scribal tradition has grown up. But you also have to recognize that the fancy details of ceremonial of scribal traditions inevitably will be later after the revelation. They won't be there at the beginning. See, part of the difficulty of tonight's lecture is that I'm going into this, and you need to have also some general background about the time of the prophet and the rusticity and the orality of that time and what conditions were like in Mecca and Arabia, and that would explain something about the transmission of the Quran and also the very nature of the text and even its contents. And that would include some of these facts. Although ancient classical civilization lived and existed all around Arabia and had for centuries by the time of Muhammad, by these years, these dates. That civilization, yes?
Don't let me interrupt you immediately every time. I mean, you can get to me eventually.
Right.
I was wondering, is the Quran a sacred object as the Torah is?
Yes.
And is there an equivalent in mosque when the Torah is read, it's read from the scroll form?
No.
Is there any kind of equivalent?
No, not at all. There's no scrolls, and the Quran never was written on scroll. That's because it was written down only after the book had been invented. And when was that, teachers? The invention of the book. That is, the bound book as opposed to the scroll. Very, very important, significant invention. About the year 150, the 2nd century in the Roman Empire. And the way in which that invention took place was that the Roman priests used to write in some kind of writing in chalk, maybe even on wooden boards, and they would bind those together with kind of rope or something. And that suggested apparently the idea that the same could be done more efficiently with paper. And when the book was invented, Christianity appropriated that and ran with it, and all of the early Christian literature was written basically in book rather than scroll form, except, of course, probably the earliest manuscripts of New Testament documents would have been written on scrolls instead of in book. But book came quickly into use after that.
How is it enlightening to know the order of the recitations? Why would we care?
Well, because historically, people would then develop a kind of historicizing argument about the order of the revelations came in such and such, so you see a certain development of thought or something like that. From the Muslim point of view, it is different importance, because since it's all from God, it would all be timeless, and there wouldn't be any necessity of one thing being more important than another, except for the principle of abrogation, which is based on Surah 2, verse 106, that says if we cause a revelation, if we abrogate a revelation or cause it to be forgotten, we bring a better one than it or something, or its equivalent. And that is taken as referring to specific verses being abrogated or canceled. And so the whole study of that became a major area of Quranic exegesis, and therefore it became very important to the Muslims by the 3rd century of Islam to know what the order of the revelations were. But by that time, it wasn't possible generally to know the order any longer, and as a result, there was a lot of argument about that. Now, sometimes, in a general way, the order of revelations can be seen, but a specific way it cannot be seen. Here we have to mention the overall character of the Quranic text. This is absolutely necessary. The Quran has often been deemed a confusing, difficult, and incomprehensible book, which was the exact phrase used by the French philosopher Voltaire in describing his experience of reading the Quran. Not that he may have been helped by the versions that were available in French in his day, but today there is a counter trend that tends to see the Quran as more of a unity than it was viewed before. The Muslims themselves caused the Quran to not be viewed entirely as a unity, because in the criticism that was meant to permit the elaboration of abrogation doctrines, that a certain verse canceled another verse's effect. And that became very elaborate at one point in medieval Muslim history. It was often asserted that each verse came down for a specific reason. So you can find a discourse in the Quran where the verses are obviously related, and yet there are some traditions that say verse A came down at such and such a time, and verse B with reference to something else, and verse C with reference to something else, in an order like that. And there's a tendency or a trend among modern Muslims to go back on all of that and to discountenance that and to view the Quran as greater unity and to view the surahs in the Quran as being more unified than that kind of teaching would allow. And anyhow, the environment of Arabia was an oral environment in spite of surrounding civilization. And there was fairly little writing that was in circulation in Arabia itself, although, as you can see from reading the Quranic text that refers to book and books and so on, there obviously was some writing. And the environment overall was oral. The word Quran means the recitation. The Quran was meant to be recited orally. It still is recited orally. Today, Quran reciters have their tapes and their CDs for sale, just like popular music, and it competes with popular music. The many pious people will only listen to the Quran and won't listen to music at all. And the many people, then they will sit around and discuss the merits of various reciters, just like someone would be discussing the merits of art of whatever kind. And the idea that the Quran is the recited Quran, that is overwhelmingly important. The transmission of the Quran down to this day is entirely an oral transmission. That is, of course, there are written texts, but for the Muslims, the written texts do not have the authority of the oral transmission. Once when I was in Jordan and I was meeting about 20 of the religious scholars of Islam in the University of Jordan, and they had asked me many questions about Islam in America and so on, and then they said, well, we asked you, would you like to ask us something? And I said, yes, we have an argument in our community about authority. And some people are saying, well, did you study this book with some sheikh who had studied it with a sheikh which goes back in unbroken chain to the original writer? Do you have to do that to be able to use a book, or can you just pick up a book and read it and talk about it? And they laughed and they said, well, of course, nowadays, if everyone expected everyone else to have studied with someone and to present their proofs of authority every time they spoke, we wouldn't get anywhere. It would be impossible. So of course you can go read a book. But then the one who was specialized in the Quran said that is true, that you can take written transmission of things, but not with the Quran. The Quran has an oral transmission that is down to the present time, has very strict standards when the kids memorize it, and they usually memorize it as kids. And I'm sorry that in my own case I didn't put more effort into memorizing it. I have memorized about 30% of the text, but people will spend a lot of effort on that, memorizing it, and then the test will come up. And I asked my friends who have memorized the whole text, how were you tested in Saudi Arabia and in Morocco and so on? And they said, well, let's see, there's one test is that you sit with your sheikh and you recite the entire text to him from memory. And I said, do they don't make you just recite part of it? No, you have to recite the whole thing. Otherwise, you don't get the certificate for that. And then in Morocco, somebody said, well, in Morocco, you can also write out the whole text longhand, the entire book, and that will pass you. And in the former test, where you have to recite the whole thing to your sheikh, and then after that, you go in front of a committee of several sheikhs, including the director of the university, of the college in the university, the dean, I guess it would be, you'd say. And you have to, there they will test you, and they'll say a few words of a verse, and you have to complete it accurately on the spot. And so it's taken very seriously the degree to which you transmit the text in written form, in oral form. And the orality of the text is very important if you're going to get anything out of it and understand it. It is like Herodotus in Greek, but it's more like Homer. Because Homer is the foundational writing in Greek, and it's very strange writing. It has its own form of Greek that isn't quite like any other Greek. Same with the Quran, not quite like any other Arabic.